Yes, that's the real Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, widely regarded as one of the most successful and profitable rock songs of all time. The music was written in 1970 by Jimmy Page, the band's founder. But where did it come from? Might the composer have heard this piece 2 years earlier? That was a track called Taurus, performed by Spirit and written by a guitarist known as Randy California. Mr. California died in 1997, but a lawyer acting for his estate recently announced that it would be suing Led Zeppelin for breach of copyright. That's the right you have to stop all or a substantial part of your work being used without your permission. It's certainly not the first time that lawyers have brought claims of this kind. And that's where Peter Oxendale comes in. He's a forensic musicologist. That means he gives expert evidence in court when musicians claim that copyright has been breached.
The old adage was, where there's a hit, there's a writ. Now, of course, the word writ's now become antiquated. And you have now, where there's a hit, there's a claim form, but it hasn't got the same ring to it. I don't think. I mean, there are many, many, many claims of infringement these days. I'm doing nearly 450 cases a year at the moment. Nearly every big record, there are inevitably a number of claims. And because there are issues where songs can sound the same without being copied, many people think they'll have a go. My job is to try and identify issues and make them clear to the courts so the courts can form their own view.
It's much easier to get hold of recorded music. It's online, it's being streamed on the internet. Has that led to an increase in the number of claims of infringement of copyright?
It certainly has. And one of the main reasons is, of course, the internet being so freely available to everybody. In the olden days, in the 70s and the 60s and the 80s and so on and so forth, people would publish songs in a conventional manner, and they still do. But what happens nowadays, as I'm sure you know, is that with YouTube and with Spotify and with MySpace, virtually anyone can compose a song in their front room and put it online by making it accessible to anybody. And that's one of the big issues.
What do you have to prove to establish a breach of copyright?
Well, the most important test of all is that the similarities, if there are any similarities, are the result of copying. Without copying, there can be no infringement.
It could be a coincidence then.
Coincidence is a perfect defense. It happens from time to time. There's some very famous cases. Michael Jackson had a very famous claim.
Hold me like the river Jordan, and I will then say to thee,
from Albano.
Caro, grande genigliano, dolce sognatore.
The Swans of Balacca, in Italy, where the courts ruled and showed that in fact the similarities were the result of coincidence. Coincidence does happen.
But on the other hand, you may copy deliberately, or you may copy accidentally, subconsciously, I suppose.
Well, subconscious copying is always an issue, and perhaps one of the most famous cases on that is the George Harrison case, 1970s, My Sweet Lord. Against He's So Fine.
That handsome boy was there, one with the wavy hair. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, but I'm not.
And what happened in the end?
Well, in that case, the judge, and in fact Harrison, used the strange term, subconscious plagiarism, and said that what had happened is that George Harrison had heard, the court said, and George Harrison said, the Ronnie Mac tune He's So Fine, and his subconscious had regurgitated as My Sweet Lord.
And in the end, Harrison had to pay?
Harrison had to pay. In that particular instance, it was very interesting because there was a musical fingerprint, an idiosyncrasy, a murder weapon, if you like, which showed that the similarities were the result of copying. In that particular case, there were two motifs in both works which had a number of features in common. The first motif, we call motif A, is this. He's so fine, my sweet Lord. In both works it's repeated, and again, and again. Now, how many works repeat four motifs like that in succession? Very few. But then we have motif B, which again is repeated, but in both works we have That's an appoggiatura, it's a grace note. And that was, in fact, the murder weapon, the fingerprint, which sealed the fate of the song.
Tell us about some of the cases you've been involved in.
One of the most famous cases that I think you will probably know is the case of A Whiter Shade of Pale.
What were the issues in that particular case?
It was Matthew Fisher, was the organ player with a Procol Harum, and the very famous record was A Whiter Shade of Pale, which was released in the summer of love of 1967. What it was essentially was that Gary Brooker had written this piece using a piece of bark. Now, Bach died in 1750. That's Johann Sebastian Bach. And so his works are in the common domain and open for anyone to use. And in fact, that piece of music, Air on the G String, was used for the Hamlet ads on TV. Now, Gary played it, and it was pretty damn good. But when they got the organ player in Matthew Fisher, he decided, as he should do, to try and make it better and better. And so he extemporized or arranged that and developed that tune, and also interpolated pieces of another piece by Johann Sebastian Bach called Wackert auf, Sleep is Awake. And he made this combined piece, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's the iconic line that we all know and love. However, the song had been written previously by Brooker and Reed, and the point was, did he deserve to have a claim to be a joint author? Well, that was in 67. Some 40 years later, a claim came to the courts, and Matthew Fisher did claim to be a joint author of the work. I was involved in the case, and we lost it, won it on appeal, and then we went to the House of Lords.
And Matthew Fisher won his claim?
Precisely that. And also, I think it's the only time ever that the House of Lords has been asked to judge on a copyright infringement claim. I also think it's the last case in the House of Lords before it became the Supreme Court. So a very interesting case for me to get involved with.
In that case, as you say, it took nearly 40 years for the claim to be brought, but presumably it's worthwhile financially if the piece of music is very successful.
Well, it is, because copyright is a property right. It's a very important property right. It's a very valuable right. And in the UK, at the moment, with copyright subsists 70 years post-mortem. In other words, 70 years after you're dead, you can leave it to your kids. So if you win part of a copyright or control part of a copyright, it's a very important asset to have. And so what a claimant will be looking for, if it's all possible, is to achieve a piece of that copyright or that property for himself for the rest of his life, for 70 years thereafter.
If it's a successful piece of music, it could be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, even more.
Well, it could be, but what tends to happen is obviously some works have a limited window to be exploited, but with synchronizations like adverts, for example, or films and so on and so forth, this can be very, very financially rewarding in years to come. So a right well worth having.
You bet. That was Peter Oxendale, the forensic musicologist. Last Friday, Google announced its initial response to a case it